Behold, the infamous Goblin Slayer, a legend among legends, a ladies' man to his core and a warrior of honor. Aside from his unusual riz and strict attitude, Goblin Slayer has to be the hardest working man I've ever seen. Even though countless women jump at the opportunity to lay in bed with him, he has one goal and one goal only: goblin slaying. Meet Anna, an ambitious priestess who was gifted divine blessings from the divine and wanted to be an adventurer to help people. How naive of her. The clerk tried explaining the ranks to her and how long it would take to climb up the ladder. She was given the lowest rank and was told to take it easy. She pointed towards the board for missions, and once her registration was complete, a random team asked her to join since they wanted a healer. She was tempted to help, and despite being warned, they paid no heed like a bunch of reckless newbies. They informed her how they accepted goblin slaying missions, but the clerk advised against this, since goblins were no joke. These cocky bunch paid no heed to her remarks and were feeling pumped. Upon entering the cave, the priestess was worried, and the team kept on downplaying the goblins' level, calling them mere fodder, even comparing them to little children and making a fool of themselves. One of their members was a witch who graduated from the capital, and as they headed deeper into the dungeon, the priestess asked if they brought some potions with them. However, they were broke adjacent and went in blindly. Soon enough, they heard a voice and got separated. While the priestess was falling back, she heard more noise from behind, and there they were, vicious goblins. They attacked all at once and caught them by surprise. The team tried their best to aid one another, and the priestess tried healing one of them, however. The goblins were too much for them. The party was terrified, and despite trying their best, they were no match and the priestess had to run away. Thankfully, a heroic knight clad in armor came to rescue the day. The infamous Goblin Slayer eviscerated all the heathens and saved the damsel in distress. Upon seeing his silver tag, she felt a sigh of relief, and he gave her a potion to heal herself on the spot. That sure was a close encounter. She insisted on tagging along since he saved her life, and they went ahead to seek vengeance. The Goblin Slayer explained how goblins were actually smart and learned to ambush people from countless experience. This guy sure knew what he was doing. The priestess lit a holy light, and this allowed the Goblin Slayer to get rid of the shaman and head back. She kept on blinding them with her blessing and giving the Slayer an advantage in battle. He lit them ablaze and headed deeper to the dungeon where they found a secret door. The Goblin Slayer did what he had to do and walked out of there like a bona fide warrior. The next day, the priestess went back to the guild and asked the Slayer to team up. In a flashback, we saw a young Musume, also known as Cowgirl and Goblin Slayer, arguing over her departure. She headed to the city alone, and they both felt depressed about it since they were good friends. In the present, Cowgirl is all grown up and could be my next waifu. Goblin Slayer is outside checking for goblin tracks while Cowgirl stares at him in fascination. Are these two a couple? I sure hope not, since I'd have to eliminate Goblin Slayer for her love. He seems to be paying rent to stay with them, and after eating their breakfast, the two went to the city to run errands. Their conversation seems a bit serious since Goblin Slayer wasn't willing to entertain her. Meanwhile, the guild encountered a poor fellow who was struggling with monsters. Soon enough, the place was packed with adventurers and boastful warriors. As soon as Goblin Slayer walked in, everyone started scorning him since he only took goblin missions. Everyone took missions that pleased them, and the place got hectic out of nowhere. Suddenly, the priestess came by trying to persuade our Slayer to take other missions, but he just ended up lecturing her with Cowgirl waiting for him awkwardly. Afterward, they took another goblin mission and took directions from the clerk. Slayer left Cowgirl at the guild, looking shocked, and she proceeded to wait for him all night. However, our boy was too busy grinding in the dungeon. In a flashback, we see how Slayer's sister was ravaged by goblins and is the reason he is so adamant about obliterating them from the face of the earth. He continued burning their fortress and showed no mercy to these beasts. As soon as they attacked, the priestess used her holy magic to block their escape and let them incinerate. This whole instance was tough on the little girl, even though it was an average day for our hero. The following day, he went back home to his lovely maiden. Meanwhile, thunder was blaring like crazy, and the weather seemed like something outside of biblical tales. Something surely wicked this way comes. Back at the guild, everyone was looking at the elf and her party who were looking for the Goblin Slayer. The elf and the dwarf did not seem to get along, but thankfully, the lizard man tried explaining the situation to the clerk. Soon after, the devil himself walked in like nothing happened and met the sorry bunch. They wanted to discuss an urgent matter with him, and they all headed upstairs. The priestess fell back and felt a bit depressed. Some adventurers came along trying to recruit her, but she defended him and met another seductive adventurer. The witch, also known as Maja, tried explaining her relationship with the Goblin Slayer and how she helped him with a scroll long time ago. Is that all she helped him with? The witch seems deviously cunning, and after warning the priestess, she walked away while the elf tried recruiting the Goblin Slayer to her crew. After criticizing him and arguing with the dwarf, they debriefed him of the Demon King and realized he was not interested in anything but goblins. Afterward, the lizard convinced him to eliminate the goblins who were causing chaos. They explained what they knew of the nest and asked him for assistance, since the military refused to destroy them. He then collected his coins and wanted to head out. The priestess asked to join and pleaded him, since they were a duo. This guy sure is tough. The rest followed right after, and they ended up making a bonfire while forming a strategy to eliminate the goblins. The elf ended up sharing some food, and the dwarf followed up by offering some wine. They were all impressed, and the elf got a tad bit too drunk. Afterward, the Slayer shared some cheese, and this caught the lizard off guard. They continued discussing about their abilities and background. Before they realized, these unruly bunch were actually bonding. Soon enough, they started discussing about goblins and their arrival. Some theorized that the goblins came from the green moon above them, and the Slayer confessed about his older sister. The rest got tired and decided to rest for the night. Cowgirl was still waiting for her hopeless lover, and the next day, they officially raided the Goblin dungeon. The Goblin Slayer soaked some blood to smear it all over his comrades, in hopes of camouflaging their scents. Afterwards, they went into the dungeon looking at the artistry on the wall, while the elf complained about the blood. They came to a sudden halt when they noticed weird signs on the ground. They hypothesized that it could be a trap. The dwarf agreed, and the Goblin Slayer led the way deep inside. As they went in, the stench grew pungent, and they found a poor soul locked. Just then, a goblin attacked out of nowhere and was struck down. Afterward, the lizard conjured a summoning and helped the prisoner escape. After taking out a map, the Goblin Slayer was ready to move forward and slay a bunch of vicious miscreants. The elf kept on knocking them down with her arrow, and they huddled together to strategize a plan. Meanwhile, the Goblin Slayer was acting tough and bossing them around. The elf became emotional after seeing one of her kind being tortured, and the team seemed to have found common ground. After moving a bit, they found a bunch of goblins sleeping and laid an ambush. The dwarf released some wine through the air to intoxicate them, and the priestess fortified it with a silence spell. Afterward, the team went to work doing what they do best. The elf was studying the Goblin Slayer's movement, and soon after, they had completed their mission with ease. However, things weren't going to be that simple, since they encountered a gigantic ogre. Not only was this guy gigantic, but he was among the Demon Lord's generals. This should be terrifying. He was able to wield elemental magic and threw a fireball at them, which the priestess defended. Things went from bad to worse real quick for our sorry bunch. The lizard summoned more warriors using an ancient spell, and the dwarf kept on throwing rocks at the ogre. This severely damaged him while the Slayer tried attacking and was swatted away. It seems the ogre was capable of regeneration, and the priestess headed towards the Slayer in hopes of healing him. The team was struggling to keep up, and things seemed dire. The priestess gave some healing potions to our Slayer, who was ready to wreak havoc. He walked with some courage and pride, however. The ogre seemed unbeatable. Even so, the Slayer unleashed an unearthly power on him, completely obliterating the ogre. He used a scroll which unlocked a swift sea attack. Afterwards, the goblin laid the big guy to rest and went back home confidently. What an unexpected turn of events. The next day, Goblin Slayer was conducting his usual goblin inspection while Cowgirl tried flirting with him. Even though it was subtle, it still was obvious to the naked eye. Meanwhile, another set of adventurers were struggling with sewer rodents, and we saw firsthand how powerful magic was. Even so, they ended up running away and received no rewards for their cowardice. The man kept on complaining about the sword he left behind, and they both were dead broke. Elsewhere, Goblin Slayer was visited by his team, who wanted to ask if he had more cheese in his inventory. It seems the lizard fell in love with it, and the elf wanted to ask him out on another adventure. Back at the guild, The poor kid was begging the advanced adventurers for a spare sword, and the magician gave him a candle to locate his hidden sword. It grew hotter as he approached the lost item. Afterward, the Goblin Slayer went to the blacksmith looking for repairs and ran into the hopeless priestess who ranked up. Obsidian rank, would you look at that? She was extremely grateful about her promotion, while the adventurers were still begging for another sword. They had no chance and went to the guild clerk to ask for help. However, she suggested asking Goblin Slayer for advice since he was knowledgeable. He gave them some good advice and told them to use clubs to retrieve their swords. Afterward, the clerk asked the Slayer for some assistance in observing a promotion exam. Elsewhere, the adventurers used the candle to locate their missing sword and killed a rodent using the club. Meanwhile, the clerk was interrogating a cocky adventurer who stole money from his team. A truth detector was present who confirmed his deception, and the clerk started cracking down on him. She demoted him and exiled him from the guild. The guy started going crazy and tried attacking, but was immediately stopped. Elsewhere, the adventurers were attacked by nasty bugs and found themselves cornered. As a result, they threw the candle and electrocuted the bugs, giving them a chance. After all was said and done, they managed to successfully defeat them. The clerk, on the other hand, was truly grateful to the Slayer who left in a hurry, while the truth detector lady kept on teasing the clerk for her crush on the Slayer. I guess there's no escaping this spell. Meanwhile, 3 adventurers raided Alicia's castle to destroy his evil plans. Wait a minute, is he a lich or an undead? It doesn't matter since they annihilated him in one shot. Elsewhere, rumors were spreading around in the guild about the hero's successful conquest. Goblin Slayer, on the other hand, was focused on one thing and one thing only: goblin slaying. Nothing else mattered in his agenda, and he wasn't even listening to the priestess or elf. Even though they were a group, there was no democracy, and it all entailed on goblin slaying. Left with no option, they all agreed under the condition that they won't use fire, poison, or water to kill them. Then what is he supposed to use? Cuddles and snuggles? They then arrived to a nearby town who summoned them, and the place looked luxuriously beautiful. They were all amazed by the scenery while Goblin Slayer headed straight towards his client, also known as the Sword Maiden, an archbishop who helped defeat the Demon Lord years ago. Upon first glance, you can tell she was divinely gorgeous. Why did she have a blindfold, though? Was she trying to imitate Gojo? She then started narrating her story of how goblins had been attacking their town frequently. Goblins were assaulting everyone, and the group estimated that the goblins were using the lower ruins to unleash surprise attacks. The archbishop asked a lot of people to help, but they all refused, until of course, Goblin Slayer came to the rescue. She begged him to help her and save the town, but Goblin Slayer was acting indifferent to her suffering. Afterward, they decided to head to the sewers. When the archbishop revealed how the military force won't help them, as such, they were on their own. She continued to unveil a map of the town and the sewers. Without further ado, Goblin Slayer was anxious to slay some demonic mongrels. Soon after, they headed down and started beating up some weak-foot soldiers. But this was only the beginning, according to Goblin Slayer. They weren't even close to the source. As they continued to march forward, the elf sensed something strange and started to hear water. The dwarf estimated it could be leakage, but then they were all ambushed by goblins riding on a boat. The priestess used her magic to shield them from the arrows. But more importantly, since when did goblins possess intelligence? The crew was stuck, thinking what to do next, and Goblin Slayer prepared what seemed like a mini grenade. As soon as the barrier was down, he threw the jar which contained toxins. This allowed them to attack head-on and knock them off the boat. Wait a minute, can't goblins swim? Either way, it seems like the crew were doing pretty decent, and the dwarf cemented their victory with impressive earthbending skills. They then encountered a gigantic crocodile, but they called it a swamp dragon. This creature was extremely terrifying, to be honest. Goblin Slayer carried the priestess while they made a run for it, and then a bunch of goblins on boats were ambushed by the swamp dragon after being led by the priestess. Now this is how you outsmart your opponents, to be honest, Goblin Slayer informed them, how someone showed the goblins how to use boats, indicating a traitor amidst their ranks. I wonder who it could have been. This must have been the result of something diabolical. The following day, the priestess was enjoying her bath, and it seems the party declined her offer due to their personal reasons. As expected, Goblin Slayer walked off and left them in the dark. The poor girl started feeling anxious, and that's when the Sword Maiden showed up looking fabulous as usual. She had the most amazing melons the priestess has ever seen. our beautiful queen proceeded to explain the history behind her war scars and complimented the priestess for her due diligence and hard work. As she twirled her hair and stood up, we were taken aback by her unfound beauty. Soon after, she warned her of Goblin Slayer and how he prefers isolation over companionship. One day, he is bound to leave, and these words took the priestess by storm. Later that night, the elf was walking in town and kept on receiving fishy looks. Fortunately, she met up with Goblin Slayer, who was lost in thought and tried looking for another goblin mission on the news board. No matter how hard he tried to look, there was nothing remotely related to goblins anywhere. He was about to give up until he purchased a canary and headed towards the sewers with his gang. The group felt confused why he brought the bird along, and our friendly warrior explained how canaries scream when they smell poison gas. Oh wow, what a genius move. This guy must be a genius tactician. Imagine if he led an army. They were all super impressed with his knowledge, and the priestess kept on recalling the maiden's word. They opened a door and noticed how the torch was missing, indicating the presence of someone else or something else. The dwarf surmised that they could be warriors or adventurers seeking to search for treasure. However, it could also be a mass grave meant to protect their legacies. They were unsure, and Goblin Slayer wasn't willing to stand there and find out. The man stood on business and pushed them to fulfill their roles, which was slaying goblins at any cost. They ran into another door, and Goblin Slayer bashed it open. He held the priestess back and told her it was a trap. The door closed behind them, and before they knew it, the goblins unleashed the poison gas into the room, leaving them dead to rights. The dwarf tried thinking of a plan while the priestess was panicking. Luckily, the Goblin Slayer gave them some material to use as a mask. He gave the dwarf some equipments to block the poisonous gas from entering, and the shorty did not disappoint. The lizard stood still, feeling dazed, and they ended up barricading the door to slow them down. The goblins tried breaking down the door as our heroic warriors armed themselves for combat. The lizard used his spell to summon elite warriors, whilst the priestess used her defensive magic to barricade them inside. But things weren't over just yet, and the goblins made it through in droves. Before they realized it, there was a goblin champion amidst them. The younglings rushed at them with fervor, and the Goblin Slayer didn't waste any time eliminating them with his bare hands. What a cinematic performance. There were too many of them, and the priestess was started to feel weakened. The champion was on another level and knocked the Goblin Slayer down, fatally injuring him. The priestess panicked, and the goblins broke the barrier. Oh man, this was about to go horribly wrong. The champion wasted no time, and Goblin Slayer felt desperate and weak. However, his life started flashing before his eyes, and his demon mode was unlocked. He got up and held the champion in a rear naked choke, strangling him with some leftover hair he found on the ground. Now that's what you call resourceful. The champion tried fighting for dear life, and the dwarf saved the elf. Would you look at that? The Goblin Slayer actually did it. He managed to defeat a champion all on his own. What a terrifying aura from this man. The rest of the goblins ran away in fear of the legend, and the elf came to his aid. The dwarf helped, and the lizard told them she was all right. Priestess tried apologizing for her weakness and started shedding tears. Before they knew it, the Goblin Slayer fell to the ground and rattled them to the core. Wait a minute, is this the end for our brave hero? No, it can't be. In a flashback, the young Goblin Slayer was sitting in a cave, begging for his master's help. All the while, he was being reprimanded by this deep, wretched voice echoing all around him. He felt miserable and stood there enduring the pain. All of a sudden, his master showed up, and it was actually a goblin. What a major plot twist. To think the Goblin Slayer's master was actually a goblin, the sense of irony is surreal. He gave him a riddle and told him to answer before the spikes fall down. What? Isn't this a bit harsh for the kid? I mean, give this man a break. What a hideous-looking goblin, though. Back in the present, the Goblin Slayer woke up without his armor, and our boy was shredded. Also, is that the priestess sleeping besides him? The busty Iron Maiden made her way into his chambers to congratulate him on his victory. She sat beside him and asked how he was feeling. My guy must be thrilled since he slept with 2 hotties, but I bet he doesn't remember any of it. The priestess was so worried, and that's when the Iron Maiden confessed her past run-in with the goblins. Her scars were from those pesky monsters, and her traumatic past still haunts her to this day. Not only was she traumatized, but her vision was taken away from her, and she tried tempting the Goblin Slayer using her seductive touch. Even so, this man was made of steel and gave 0 f***s. Was it getting cold in there because her melons were popping? Soon after, the priestess woke up feeling ashamed and asked him how he was feeling. He put on his armor and told her everything was okay. The gang barged in without knocking and made themselves home. The Goblin Slayer was more worried about the canary, though, who was fortunately okay. The elf continued to tease the poor priestess, who was blushing like a tomato. The lizard insisted they recover first, but the dwarf interjected and suggested eating first. The Goblin Slayer was taken aback after hearing they still hadn't eaten anything. Now that's loyalty for you. Afterward, they went to a fine Italian restaurant and started munching like crazy. Once they were done, the priestess and the slayer were told to take a break while they scoured the sewers. The young lady was feeling anxious walking alongside him, since he seemed indifferent towards everything. She tried confronting him about it, but the guy was too busy thinking of what to do next. He told her to replace her armor, and she went to have it repaired, since it was special to her. The Goblin Slayer also handed in his entire equipment for some maintenance. Since he was a silver rank, they took him seriously, especially after he paid in advance. He chose a sword he liked and continued to patch it up for his mission. The priestess was proud, and later on, the two went on a walk and encountered an ice cream stand. They both didn't know what it was, and he told her to buy some for the sake of experimentation. This guy has zero riz, to be honest with you. I doubt he'd ever get laid with this attitude. The priestess really enjoyed it, and the slayer wanted to know all about it, since he considered it was a spell at first. The seller tried explaining the science behind it, and he bought one for himself. As they sat on a bench, staring at the stunning sunset, the priestess started talking about the recent goblin attacks. That's when he started opening up and talking about his past, how he was afraid all the time, and how his fear held him back from multiple opportunities. But now, he had someone he could rely on, and this gave the priestess goosebumps. Was she smitten with him? It would seem that way. Soon after, a couple of adventurers headed their way after he summoned them with a letter. The witch was looking impeccable as always. Those melons were quite delicious to look at. After delivering the package he asked for, they started giving him an attitude. Later that night, the cowgirl was growing worried since the Goblin Slayer hasn't been back in a while. Despite his disappearance, she had hope and refused to let him go. Elsewhere, the Slayer and his gang went back to the sewers, and it seemed he was holding a sack of rice or something. The lizard led them towards a strange-looking monster. The one-eyed Antichrist is what they should have labeled it. They couldn't get past it since its lasers were quite deadly. The lizard explained its ability as disintegrate, that which destroys everything it touches. The Goblin Slayer was trying to think of a plan, and the priestess asked if she should put up a barrier. The elf kept on mouthing off about ethical attacks, but in times of crisis, the means always justify the ends, in my opinion. Without wasting any more time, she went into the room and tried distracting the eyeball, while the dwarf spit some alcohol to blur its vision and dampen its consciousness. That's when the Slayer released the flower, creating a smoke screen. The lizard took the opportunity to summon a warrior, and the priestess was ready to cast a spell. She used her protection barrier, and upon unleashing the disintegration laser, the monster ended up destroying itself. Now that's what you call amazing. The Goblin Slayer has the IQ of a genius. Had he not chosen this barbaric career, he could have made it as a teacher or a scholar. The gang admired his effort and thanked him for bringing the pesky monster down. Afterward, the lizard showed them a mirror and asked the priestess to investigate. Upon touching it, the Goblin Slayer realized it was a portal, and they were able to see the goblin colony from afar. The elf couldn't believe her eyes, since the goblins were using advanced technology and were able to teleport seamlessly. Oh no, this sounds like a lot of trouble. Someone powerful must be aiding them in their conquest. Otherwise, there's no way they figured this out on their own. Goblins are not built like that. The Goblin Slayer tried thinking of a plan on the spot, and soon after, an army of goblins came running to protect their precious portal. They were stuck, and after looking around, they decided to barricade the door and build a fortress around them. They finished their preparations, and the priestess was ready to cast her spell as well. The lizard volunteered to summon a warrior and proceeded to cast a spell. The dwarf was told to stay on the lookout, while the elf picked a fight with him out of friendly spite. The goblins were nearing the door, and the Slayer told them to give it their all. As soon as they reached them, the elf took her position and shot the first arrow. The Slayer used a slingshot, and they slowly started culling their numbers. There were still many of them standing, and it seems like they were using arrows as well. Fortunately, the lizard skeleton saved them in the nick of time, while the lizard was trying to break the portal. He empowered his muscles and went to work while a hobgoblin showed up out of nowhere. The elf was growing worried, and the slayer helped gather more arrows for her. The dwarf was holding his own, and the priestess decided to help the lizard. The big guy was looking quite fierce, but our unruly bunch weren't willing to give up without a fight. All of a sudden, the lizard did it and brought down the portal. The slayer baited him to approach, and using the priestess's holy light, they managed to blind them, and the dwarf unleashed hell upon them via his spells. Color me impressed. They actually managed to defeat an entire army and came out unscathed. The elf started criticizing their risky plan while the lizard was feeling grateful for everything. However, the portal wasn't shattered, but does it still work? Elsewhere, the maiden was approached by the slayer who had great news for her. However, he confronted her about knowing the goblins were inside the sewers and asked her why she kept silent about it. He also asked if the alligator swamp was her doing, to which she agreed. All of this seems to bother the goblin slayer, who couldn't wrap his head around it. If she had known of the atrocities the goblins were committing, how could she remain silent? It was a travesty to even think about. But the maiden had her own agenda, which was nothing like he imagined. Due to her past trauma, she was still terrified of these heathens and wanted nothing to do with them. That's why she wanted them to stay in the sewers. Also, since she was considered a hero, no one would believe her if she claimed goblins were a threat. As such, she was stuck in between a rock and a hard place. Fortunately for her, the heaven-sent guardian came to thwart the goblins' onslaught and rescue the desperate damsel in distress. She gave her sincere gratitude and couldn't explain the happiness she was feeling now that the goblins were gone. Our knight in shining armor really did pull a number on her. Ha! These two should get married. They'd make a perfect couple. He even made her weak in the knees. Now that's next level Riz. Now that their mission was done, they were heading back to their hometown feeling satisfied and fulfilled. They saved the town, got paid heavily, and evolved as warriors. The Goblin Slayer suggested making ice cream when they returned and started explaining the details of making it. The dwarf insisted to help, and everyone chimed in to taste this delicious nectar of the heavens. We were then flashed to a brutal war zone. A fierce battle was underway between the forces of darkness and good. The heroes were fighting against the infamous Demon King. Meanwhile, the gang were still traveling back home, while Goblin Slayer started reminiscing of his first crush. Of a time she confessed her admiration, and he shut her down like a sore loser. What was his problem? Oh yeah, she went to the city and left him. His sister told him not to let his anger and envy take over. Otherwise, he'll also end up as a goblin. She insisted he apologize, and later that night, she made him his favorite dinner. This memory was very fond to him, and now he could barely remember any of it. He got out to inspect the fields and make sure there were no goblin attacks. Out of nowhere, the heavenly bestowed cowgirl graced us with her royal presence. Now this girl is a keeper. Don't fumble the bag, my friend. Her uncle was thrilled, since the heroes defeated the demon lord, and the cowgirl served them breakfast like the perfect waifu she was. Since she had some deliveries in town, Goblin Slayer volunteered to take her. As they were walking to town, he told her he had errands to run and went back to the guild where no one recognized him because of his armor. They treated him like he was a newbie and tried talking down to him. Even the witch didn't recognize him. However, after putting on his new armor, the old one was beyond repair. This was a man on a mission, I tell you. He stood there watching a couple of adventurers sparring, and one of them tried chatting him up about the goblin situation in town. She even tried inducting him into their gang, but we all know that's not going to happen. She stepped in and looking beautiful doing it. Meanwhile, the priestess ran into the Goblin Slayer and asked him what he was doing here. That's when the nosy clerk interrupted and tried shooting her shot with him. They both had a crush on him, and things felt really awkward. She then handed him a letter and told him there were no goblin missions lately. The priestess kept on thinking about the maiden when the gang showed up and invited them to lunch. The elf insisted he join, and that's when the cowgirl showed up. Oh wow, who would have thought they would all gather in one place? Goblin Slayer might as well form a harem at this point. The cowgirl, the elf, the priestess, and the clerk. He could even add the maiden to make it a 5-piece. The group decided to celebrate their victory and started recalling the details of the battle. The clerk then told them about the new training home they planned on opening, where veteran adventurers could train the newbies on the art of warfare and defending themselves from danger. Sounds like a great idea if you ask me. Consider it a win-win situation, the cowgirl agreed, since she wanted him to retire. Afterward, they started walking back home, and she confessed how she was worried about him. The following day, he opened the letter, and it was in fact from the maiden. The Slayer was on her mind, and her dreams were now goblin-free, thanks to his efforts. Peace was finally an achievable concept, and everything seemed to go smoothly. Later that night, the bar was pumped up to witness the drinking competition between the dwarf and the elf. They were all rooting for them, and even placed bets to see who would win. The witch had her money on the elf, while the rest chose the stubborn dwarf. Gambling on a drinking competition? What an absurd idea. The lizard told the priestess to watch and have fun, while the goblin slayer was staring into the moon alongside his beautiful crush. Can she even be considered as his girlfriend at this point? Well, she surely pulled him in like a dominatrix and tried to romanticize the moment. Unfortunately, his armor was getting in the way, and she was unable to access his body. She went to bed feeling depressed and wondered if she'd ever have a chance with him. The town was buzzing with celebrations after the Demon King's defeat, and it seems the dwarf won the drinking competition. What was the Goblin Slayer up to now? Hold up, were those footprints? The cowgirl was cooking breakfast when Goblin Slayer came bearing bad news. There was tracks, and it was those of goblins. Not just ordinary ones either, an entire battalion, to make matters worse. This was on open ground, and he wasn't used to fighting like this. Also, they weren't led by a hobgoblin or a champion. Rather, a goblin lord. The highest level a goblin can achieve in their lifetime. The attack was imminent, and the military would not intervene. Cowgirl was lost for words and couldn't fathom what was happening. Goblin Slayer was starting to lose hope and gave up on the idea of fighting them. As such, he insisted they ran away as far as they could. Despite his warning, the stubborn girl refused and told him to F off. She wasn't willing to let him go that easily, and he started telling her of the atrocities goblins are known for. Death is considered a mercy, and that's if they granted it. Even so, Cowgirl had balls of steel and started shedding tears. She didn't want to leave him for a second time and watch him forfeit his life for nothing. Seeing her resolve, Goblin Slayer promised to do whatever it takes. Before he left, her uncle told him to watch out and take care of himself, since she loved him with all her heart and didn't want to see him get hurt. The Goblin Slayer went to the guild and tried talking to the witch and her gang. Wait, was he addressing everyone in the guild? He started informing them of the imminent goblin attack and how there were more than 100 strong warriors amongst them. He went on to explain how powerful a goblin lord was and the danger it posed. He even bowed down and begged for their help. One cocky adventurer got up and asked for a fair compensation if he wanted to get the job done. The elf tried going after them, but was held back. Just then, the Goblin Slayer offered up everything he owned, including his assets and belongings. His words touched everyone involved, and his resolve motivated them to action. The cocky prick agreed to join in return for a drink, and the elf volunteered as well. The dwarf chimed in alongside the lizard. Wait, where was the priestess? She would have been ideal in this situation. The witch got up from her seat and courted the attention of the whole guild. That's when the guild offered a reward of 1 gold coin for every goblin killed. Now you're talking. The highest-ranked adventurers agreed to help as well, and seeing them join, even the newbies were inspired to help out. Slaying goblins was a dangerous job, but if everyone joined hands, they could achieve the impossible. There she was, the missing priestess. Later that night, the goblins were ready to attack, and their lord gave the signal to start the onslaught. These guys were truly barbaric in every sense of the word. What a scary bunch. Back at the farm, Cowgirl was growing worried, and soon after, a couple of them showed up looking menacing. These guys were fighting dirty, but the dwarf and witch had some tricks up their sleeves. The adventurers launched their attack, and the elf went on the offensive. As soon as they rescued the hostages, the swordsmen went into battle, laying waste to each and every living goblin. The lizard jumped in, and it seems the witch had placed a defensive barrier around them. Damn, their teamwork was on a whole other level. The newbies stayed behind to alert them of surprise attacks. They formed a wall and prepared to unleash the hidden spears on the goblin riders. What a genius strategy. I'm certain it was Goblin Slayer who came up with this battle tactic. One by one, the goblins were going down, and the humans saved one another. I told you the goblins planned everything out. He was the mastermind behind this entire strategy. It's like he was a scholar when it came to goblins. They even had a hobgoblin amongst them, and this guy was huge and powerful. His presence alone was terrifying, and wait, They even had goblin champions? Goddamn, the highest ranked adventurers volunteered to take them on head on, and this was promising to be a deadly battle. I love how nonchalant the witch is about all of this. Meanwhile, the Goblin Lord was running for dear life and ran to the infamous Goblin Slayer in the forest. Upon seeing him, the Lord started shaking like a belly dancer and lost all the courage he had. I won't lie, anyone would in the presence of this demon. The Goblin Slayer had successfully destroyed his nest, and this left the Goblin Lord no option but to fight back. Since he had nowhere to retreat to, he might as well take his revenge out on the Slayer who orchestrated this entire war. Even so, this was not going to be an easy job. Elsewhere, the newbie adventurers were giving it their all and realized just how difficult fighting goblins actually was. The elf and dwarf eliminated them on their end and awaited orders from the rest. The lizard finished things on his end as well, and only the goblin champions remained. Despite the size difference, the higher-ranked adventurers weren't letting up and gave it their all. This guy looks like Guts from Berserk, doesn't he? His partner looks stunning, though. The witch watched on as her comrade dealt the finishing blow in the most epic manner. What a scary duo. Meanwhile, the Goblin Slayer was finding it hard to pin down the Lord, and the cowgirl couldn't contain her anxiety. Fortunately, our boy did not know the meaning of giving up and tried to crawl his way back. Things started to look dire, and just as he was about to join the pearly gates, the Goblin Lord witnessed a terrifying aura emanating from the priestess. She managed to immobilize him using her barriers and almost squashed him to death. Wow, this girl is terrifying. The Lord started crying and tried begging for mercy, but she wasn't a fool, nor was the Goblin Slayer who slayed him on the spot. Yap, that's his name all right. Did they finally do it? It seems the Goblin Slayer had planned this out from the get-go, using himself as bait. The priestess used her divine healing to cure his injuries and apologized for her incompetence. She was really worried about him, huh? What a touching moment this was. Had it not been for the cowgirl, these two would have made the perfect couple. Everyone else started gathering the goblins for their reward, while the witch looked stunning as always. She is definitely my favorite character. They saluted the Slayer as he walked back home, and the cowgirl's heart skipped a beat upon seeing her savior. The following day, the heroes who defeated the Demon Lord arrived in town, hoping to join the festival, but realized the goblin infestation was getting much worse. One of them tried downplaying their strength, but another admonished her, saying goblins were the real deal. Had it not been for the Goblin Slayer, they would have never known safety. As such, the elf toasted his victory and celebrated with everyone on a job well done. These guys really managed to save the entire village and city. All hail the Goblin Slayer, I suppose. Had it not been for him, they would have had several causalities. The priestess took a nap while the cowgirl thanked her hero for his hard work. Afterward, he told her he wanted a change of pace and wanted to try other missions besides goblin slaying. Wouldn't that defeat the purpose of his name and title? What else would we call the Goblin Slayer if he wasn't killing those nasty heathens? The priestess got up and tried giving back the gold coin he gave her, but he insisted she was the one responsible for killing the Goblin Lord. As such, earned the prize, fair and square. The dynamic between these two is giving me goosebumps. Also, what happened to his left arm? Was it broken or something? Either way, the priestess tried to inspire him to work even harder for the sake of the people and asked for a reward. She wanted him to take off his helmet since she never saw him the last time. Oh, come on, show us his face already. What's with the suspense and multiple angles? Everyone was shocked and flocked towards him, since this was the first time they saw his true face. Come on, show us something. The witch had the hots for him, and the entire guild made a huge fuss out of it, but we were left in the dark. Well, that's not fair. What were the writers even thinking? Well, that's the end for this week's episode of Goblin Slayer. If you love this recap, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to stay updated.